much is your agency, and how much is the will of other entities entirely? Or is that even how to see this sea?
Hello, everyone.
Everybody wants to be seen by the big machine.
Welcome to Love and Philosophy. Today is a conversation with Michael Garfield. It's a little bit like a Song Exploder episode, except it's also a fractal Rubik's Cube, which is something Michael brings up here, and I think it describes this episode and also Michael in a really interesting way. If you know Michael, you might know him from Santa Fe Institute and the Complexity podcast that he hosted there. If you've never heard of that, don't worry. Maybe you've heard of Future Fossils podcast, which is a very different podcast. Talk about holding the paradox. Michael really does it. He can talk about fine art, he can talk about music, he can talk about mysticism at the very furthest edges, and he can also talk about really hard science. That's why Michael is here, because I find him a wonderful example of holding contradictions and exploring space beyond what people think of as oppositional. But he's also here because I really love his song called Big Machine, which you're hearing play throughout this episode a bit. And I hope you'll link and listen to it, because this whole conversation is really unpacking this song and the lyrics, but also through Michael's own journey, which is a very special journey. There really is no one like Michael Garfield. And don't worry if you don't understand half the things in this episode, because Michael's read just about every book on the planet. He's one of the people I think who loves books most in the world. We ultimately get to this place where the big machine is not about the machine at all. It's about all these connections and fractal relations that so entrance Michael and that are part of the world and that are actually about love. So we do get to that word. I really think Michael brought complexity to a lot of people. He definitely turned a lot of people on to the Santa Fe Institute, and they're doing amazing work there. And I hope you'll have a look at what they're up to. You've probably heard me talk about complexity, but just a really short definition is just that it's studying the way systems interact, or looking at all these things that we look at in science through the lens of systems instead of what we might have been looking at it through before, more atomized, for example, or something like that. And of course, a million people will say that's a crazy definition, because there's all different ways of thinking about it. So I'll just link to some notes and videos and things where you can discover complexity if you want to. But just for now, just think of it as the study of systems. It's enough to think of before we go into this fractal Rubik's Cube that we're about to enter. But if you don't care about any of that at all, you will also like this episode. For example, if you like Robert Anton Wilson, if you like Ken Wilber, if you like that side of the world, which tends to be thought of as the opposite of something like Santa Fe Institute or more hard science, you'll also like this, because those names come up within the first 5 minutes, because Michael's like that. He used to be also working with Ken Wilber. So he really has worked with lots of people who might consider themselves on very different sides of whatever academic, mystic, scientific spectrum you might have encountered. So for that reason, it can be hard at times to take it all in with Michael, and it can also be wonderfully exhilarating. He's also a musician, obviously, and he's also a very big fan of William Irwin Thompson, who is someone you may have heard me discuss because he started Lindisfarne, and I'm interested in Lindisfarne. But we don't really talk about that here. We mention Bill Thompson a few times. Mostly this is just a conversation about the big machine, and I'll just let you listen to understand what that means and how it ends up being about love. Thanks for being here, and thanks, Michael, for everything.
Living in New Mexico, where it's like...
Looks like you live in New Mexico. You have all the beautiful colors that I associate with my time in New Mexico.
Yeah, I painted my closet.
It's a good color. Two beautiful, like two of my favorite colors, that green and that blue. Anyway, hi Michael. Thanks for being on Love and Philosophy.
Hi, Andrea.
I want to talk about Big Machine. I love this song. I'm so glad I listened to it, because you can just kind of skip through these things. In the Substack, actually listen to it. It's really good. And maybe you can tell me what that song is, how it came to be, because you also mentioned this quote about wealth of information, poverty of attention, and I want to tie all that in. But first, like this song, what is it for people who haven't heard it yet?
Yeah. Okay. So there's that scene in Saving Private Ryan where they've stormed the beach of Normandy and they're all talking about what they were before the war, and Tom Hanks is like, I was the school teacher. Um, Before it became the job into which history swept me to talk about big ideas and help people wrap their heads around the emergence of what comes after modern civilization, I was a musician, or at least that's I was really committed. I told my grandmother when I was like 21, I thought that I had even odds on becoming a paleontologist or a rock star. And it kind of was that way for a while. It was like I was doing dinosaur work, and I was, playing at one point. I think I just checked, and I don't have that many shows under my belt, but it's like over 500
You
concerts
were playing the big
on
shows. The reason I laughed is
4
because one of the
continents.
questions I wanted to ask you is, did you only dream of dinosaurs when you were a kid, or did you also dream of being a famous?
I didn't start playing guitar until I was 14.
Oh,
My stepfather is an extremely capable blues guitarist who played in
wow.
these like local legend, like black blues bands in Kansas City, and I just thought he was hot stuff, and got a guitar and asked him to teach me to play it. But then, like very quickly, I realized the songs I was writing it's sort of what we were talking about before we started rolling, which is that I'll connect it to the ideas I'm having now, which is, in an age where bosses are asking you to train the AI, maybe the most valuable thing you can be to the economy is something that can't be scaled, something that's like singular. And, Stephen Johnson talks about the revenge of the humanities, and lots of people are thinking about, what it's going to look like if that, as they say, you'll have a country full of geniuses in a server farm. Okay, well, you and I have already lived through something like this. We've lived through the superstar Hollywood effect of being able to access anybody's art or music or ideas online. And so no one can be a big fish in a small pond anymore. Like everyone who is competing for attention or opportunity on the internet is competing against the best people in the world. And so like that kind of thinking of like be totally distinct, like be, if somebody else is doing it, just don't, find like pivot. That came to me very early as a guitarist because I was really interested in a particular kind of jazz inflected songwriting and fingerstyle stuff. And then I was a freshman in college and John Mayer's first major album came out, and I was like, onward, not doing that anymore. And then like it kept happening. It kept being that way of like, as soon as I was compared to someone by someone else, they're like, oh, you remind me of such and such. I was like, I'm out. Like that has become a piece of my backstory now. What's the next thing? What's the thing I don't see people doing? That means, as my buddy from the dorms, Stephen Phipps, used to say, no man is an island, but some are very long peninsulas. And so I was like, got this, kind of carved out my own thing, and just incidentally born on the same day as David Bowie and Elvis Presley and Stephen Hawking and Kim Jong-un
Oh my gosh, they
and
were all
R.
born on the same
Kelly.
day, and that's your birthday? That's
Yeah, R. Kelly and Jenny Lewis. And so you think about all of those people, what do they all have in common? It's like, well, they're all one of a kind. And
Don't
Sometimes
be the
they're,
best, be the only. I said it before we got on the Kevin Kelly thing,
yeah,
but sounds like
yeah.
you
So
already had that in
Kevin's got
mind
it.
early on. My goodness. That actually explains a lot somehow.
So the song, anyway, this kind of tension of reconciling the each person as a singular event, and then the fact that all of us are enmeshed in this planet spanning thing. I got to say, the first time I ever saw your show was the conversation that you had with Ian McGilchrist. And I was really touched by that conversation. And I love him generally and his thinking. And so for people listening, like this thing about the big machine is about, well, you can see all of this activity, the way, like the common way to see it now of, supply chains and fifth generation information warfare and the attention economy, and it's enmeshed with all. And it's like I've written about this as, living in the belly of the beast, as, that the surveillance capitalism, which I don't think is even an adequate name to describe, the Tim Morton hyperobject of what this is. It's very easy for us to see it as a machine because it's made out of things that we are used to seeing as machines, at least in part. And it is a time in which all of us, generally speaking, society is very deeply conditioned to regard the world as object rather than subject, to see things as an it. I was talking with you about how I used to work with Ken Wilber, and like that whole notion of, well, you can take a first person, second person, or third person position on anything. You can regard anything as, from the like an individual or a collective kind of frame. And so I put the sort of paranoid Lovecraftian part up front in that song of, like, how long can you go without looking at your phone? But it's like, at the same time, like asking this question of what maybe the only reason that we feel miserable right now is because we know intellectually that we are all connected inside of this planet spanning post biological, in the sense that like it's forcing us to redefine what life even is so that it can include, the inorganic. What William Irwin Thompson called planetization or planetary culture is, when the modern distinction between industry and ecology breaks down. And so like there's that, I just like telling a story in a kind of a particular way where, you meet people in the anxiety and the paranoia of where they are most likely to be, and then like the synthetic reconciliatory gesture is, but look at this, and so like I'll just say that, like, related to that, back in 2010 I had a trip where I felt this extraordinary shame because the last, which was like 2 years before, I felt like I had received a message to take on a regular meditative practice. It was like, the storm is coming. The world is only getting crazier. Start learning to center yourself in all of that. And I had, my life had been nuts and I hadn't done it. So like coming up and like the challenges of, encountering a moment of ego death, and then feeling like, that you're at the, you're at the scales of judgment and you failed, like you don't feel worthy of this sort of excess of cosmic love because I hadn't listened. Like I take this stuff seriously. It's like, oh, if you receive a message, you should do that. But I hadn't. I received an image in that experience that I think speaks to the kind of approach I've taken to philosophy and the aesthetic of that's like evident in that particular song and much of my work in general, which was like I saw this image of this fractal Rubik's cube kind of thing. It was all black, like Mecca.
That blows
Uh,
my mind to try to imagine a fractal Rubik's cube.
it's like each face. I mean, there's a specific fractal that's like this, where it's like I forget the name of it.
Like each square is a different fractal? Is that how it
Each
works?
square is 9 squares, and then each of those is 9 squares, and each of those.
Ooh.
And it was all black and is ominous. And then the whole thing rotated in the fourth dimension, which rotated it in the three visible dimensions. But each face flipped, and there was a backside that was white, and it was basically just showing me like a geometrical proof for the always alreadiness of our redemption. That like no matter how bad things get, there is always another dimension from which that sin or whatever is recontextualized and understood as like a perfect part of a deeper understanding. And so, that's the I love that moment of metanoia. I'm in the middle of teaching this course right now, and at some point in the course, I'm going to whip out Antero Ali's book, yes, Angel Tech, which is about
Oh.
the Eighth Circuit model. Robert Anton Wilson has
Mm.
this. Yeah, and at any rate, this is about personal and transpersonal development, and how they've got this. At the level between the personal and the transpersonal is what they call chapel perilous, which is where you realize that everything is connected, but it terrifies you because you are still the small you. And so that's the kind of ferryman I'm trying to be with this song and with other stuff, is like getting people from the bad trip of chapel perilous to the everything is okay.
The redemption is always there. How did you just said it in a really beautiful way. Everything's already,
Yeah, it's always already. It's like that, kind of
yeah, always already.
like the
Yeah.
Buddhist language
Right.
for, you don't become enlightened. You are always already. And I've got a big row of books here. That's like all the books I'm doing for
Oh,
my course.
whoa, cool.
Uh,
That's a lot.
but yeah, the other
It just
one,
started last night, right?
yeah,
How was
yeah,
it? Was
it was
it fun?
good. Yeah, it's
It was
like
too
the
late for me. I signed up, but it was like 2:30 in the morning or something.
oh my God. Yeah, no, I was worried because like something like 100 something people signed up because we'd opened the session to the public, but then it ended up just being mostly the people who had paid for the course. So I was like, okay, I'm not. But yeah, so like another one of the things that we're talking about, and that we just held a book club for on Humans on the Loop, is Federico Campagna's Prophetic Culture.
Oh, wow.
And this is a book about this, about the intersection of time and the world, with infinity, or not infinity, eternity, right? With the ineffable, transcendent, real, and the efforts of prophets to reconcile those, or to bring some kind of meaningful understanding about that which exceeds our capacity for linguistic description into history. And he says, I've been writing about this a lot. He talks about apocalypse versus apokatastasis, which I had not heard before, but it's this sort of theological distinction about like apocalypse is what Bill Thompson taught me to think of as misplaced concreteness. It's like putting the moment of judgment, which is actually in a kind of vertical dimension of time, into history. That creation and destruction and all of these things are there as the universe recreates itself in every moment but like apokatastasis is about everything being saved already. That like that, that we keep postponing Judgment Day because the world requires tension in order to exist. But yeah, this sense of like even the devil is saved. It kind of liberates us from having to worry about like theodicy and like concerns of like, well, why does why God, why?
There's a difference. Yeah, there's a difference between everything already being there and redemption being there and it actually being experienced, I guess, too, though. So that's
Yeah,
kind of, I mean, could
yeah,
be in different forms, could be all possible, could be multiple worlds, could be there, but you don't notice it the same way you go for a walk and there's things there you just don't notice. But I think everything you just said actually connects to what I was wanted to think about a little bit with you. This idea of that quote. It's a Herbert Simon. I'm terrible with accents. Quote
yeah.
about
Herbert Simon.
Simon. There you go. See,
Yeah, he's
I always try too
American.
hard with the language. It's true. So the Herbert Simon quote. It's wealth of information. I can't remember the quote. Maybe you do, but it's like a
Oh yeah,
dearth
let's
of
pull it up.
something,
It's a
and
very
then
popular quote,
yeah, it is a
but
dearth
I
of
didn't know
something, and it's
about it.
basically
So
yeah. Go ahead.
it's from
Do
a
you have it?
longer passage. He says, "In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention and a need to allocate that attention efficiently among the overabundance of information sources that might consume it." 1971,
Amazing.
you
But
know.
I really wonder about this quote and about you because you take in so much information and you have been doing for a long time. And yet you also have quite a lot of attention. And I mean, this gets into a lot of things I'd like to actually ask you about. But I mean, how do you think about that in your own life? I mean, I want to get to the song because it's different when we start really thinking about the technology and the internet. And I think you wrote that like you were checking your phone in some grocery store, even though you knew you couldn't get signal. I think we all know that. But just before we get to the technology part, just in general, have you always, I mean, even when you were a kid, been so able to take in so much information and constantly sort of shuffle it through yourself and your life and still be attentive? Or did you learn that?
uh I'm probably on the spectrum. Like it's not uh something that I think too much about, like trying to diagnose this, but I do care very much about what in the AI world they call the long context window, right? Like I really appreciate being able to pick up a conversation precisely where we left off after weeks, or there's a like Hermann Hesse's glass bead game. This idea that in the distant future monks are engaged in meaning making through this, the formation of uh, semantic networks between, different cultural objects. So I think that, yeah, I've always had a fairly acute memory. Like I remember in, it's not like eidetic, but I remember in middle school, like scaring a girl I had a crush on because like I had accidentally seen her phone number and like knew her phone number. I was like, well, I guess that ain't,
Oops.
I guess I better just nip that one in the bud.
Yeah, but that's
But
exactly what I mean. You seem to really get the details in a way that would seem like you would get a bandwidth problem in terms of how much you take in. But there's very few people that I've encountered who've taken in so much information. I guess there's a difference between information and encoding. You said your songs are
right,
like encoding mechanisms. However we want to put it, just for all the work that you've done with all the different podcasts and how different they are and how hard these ideas are. It just seems like so much information, such a wealth of information that you should have a poverty of attention, but you don't seem to.
Well, thank you. I mean, I definitely do feel the bandwidth issue. I think, the reason that I am so interested in this idea of like, what is it that we are living through? Like, what characterizes something that seems very obvious to be a major evolutionary transition? You and I were talking about my old boss, David Krakauer, before we got on the call. And, the paper that originally got me interested in complexity science, I did not know that he had actually collaborated on this work until 13 years later, when I'd wandered through the wilderness of art and music and futurism and all this stuff for a while, and then finally found myself back at, or like at the Santa Fe Institute, working in communications for them. And at one point I remember asking David, like, hey, have you heard of this paper on the evolution of syntactic language? And he's like, I co-authored that paper. I was like,
Of
oh,
course.
of course, like I'm a babe in the woods, it's like, and you get that feeling being around, the that's actually what I love about interacting with older people. It's like, hey, have you heard about Woodstock? I was there. But so he and Martin Nowak and Josh Plotkin and Vincent Janssen wrote a series of papers um, right around the turn of the millennium on this, on like a bottleneck that they were formalizing mathematically, and they were looking specifically at, how might we describe going from humans speak in single word utterances to humans speak in complete sentences. But I just remembered reading this paper and how they were saying that transition must have been uh, like pressured into being by you can't, at some point you can't remember more words, and like as your community becomes richer and richer in its interiority, as like it's, the things that can be thought and that must be thought in order to keep everyone cohesive enough to survive together as a group gets big enough that you just can't keep coming up with these enormous words. And so, you would have like sort of proto sentences where it's like you would create a new word just by sticking stuff together, but then you end up with these
Like
enormously
German.
long.
Yeah.
Yeah, German, exactly. It's like German is one of, you can see this kind of dynamic going on. But then at some point it's like, well, you could remember a whole lot more words if they were shorter, and you could remember a whole lot more words, or you could communicate a lot more things if you found simple rules for putting words together so that you could open up this huge recombinant possibility space. And I remember reading this paper in the senior year of my biology program at the University of Kansas in an animal communication seminar, and just deciding like on the spot that this is the thing that I need to study, because what they were saying about language seemed like it was also saying something really important about all of these other moments in the history of the cosmos where suddenly there's a qualitative shift, like something is there that was not there. The origin of life, the evolution of bacteria to complex cells, to multicellular organisms, etc. And, the closure of metabolic loops, where it's like it used to be fungi and plants just living together on the ground. Like the fungi were not eating the plants or feeding them, but then like they developed a syntax that that, created forests. Like there were
Yeah,
like groups of
some
trees, but
ideas
there
of
weren't
those.
forests until we had mycorrhizal affiliations, and so like all of this stuff started clicking together, and it was like, well, you can't study that as a paleontologist. So I was very conflicted for a while because I was going through my own uh, information scaling crisis, where it's like the identity that I had had for my entire life was I was going to grow up and work with it. Robert Bacher, my childhood mentor, in Wyoming. I would become a professor. I would, I would lecture during the year. I would do field work. I would illustrate my own books the way that he did with his. Like I knew exactly what I was doing with my life, and I had never any question otherwise. And then suddenly it's like there's something so rich and so big and so interesting that I couldn't not think about it. But to embrace it meant relativizing the entire person I believed myself to be. It's like, well, now if I were to just become a paleontologist, I would always feel like I was leaving the majority of myself on the table, like that I couldn't live with this huge remainder.
Was that music? Sorry, but is that
Oh
where
no, just like
music?
no, like I was still
What
doing
came?
the just like dinosaur science.
Yeah, I
Like
know,
I
but
couldn't do it.
what
Oh,
was it that you
this
couldn't hold
these
everything together?
questions.
Like what was
Yeah,
the
these
shift?
this well, I mean, yeah, getting more and more into music at the same time, but that particular thing was I need to understand evolution, not just like
Oh, okay, I
study
see. So it
dinosaurs. Like I
wasn't
need
just this structure of like the Jurassic Park sort of storyline. You suddenly realize there's so much more you're gonna have to take in. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, that like well that you can't answer questions about the deep patterns of the evolution of new levels of order and how uh, you know the inner worlds of living things are part of that, because I was also starting to read Ken Wilber's work at the same time and thinking about, well, there's got to be a way to articulate this mutual irreducibility and complementarity of interiors and exteriors. That has to mean something for answering questions about the evolution of language and society. And like I was like, there is a theory of intelligence, because it's like now you will find more scientists that are comfortable talking about teleology in evolution, but it's an emergent telos. It's like the direction of evolution is not the same thing that it was when people were talking about that in the 19th century. It's not that humans are at the top of this thing and then we're going to create something that's, like smarter than us. Like all of this, like sort of, the rhetoric of like God making in AI is very antiquated in the sense that they are still maintaining that, there's a direction toward more in the cosmos to smarter. And it's like, well, there is, but it's an emergent pattern anyway. So like the uh all these questions about, well, like there's like there's a few questions, the origins of life, because if at the time, one of the prestigious evolutionary biologists at my school was Ed Wiley, who had written this book on evolution and entropy. And I was like, well, he's thinking about this relationship between, the reduction of local disorder and the production of global disorder. And, he's closer than anyone I know to being able to answer some questions for me about where the order comes from and like, what evolution must have looked like before we had what we think of as like cellular life. And I asked him about this, and he's like, well, there couldn't be any evolution before DNA. And I was like, wait a minute, no, that can't be true, because there's like, I was just at the beginning of my sort of early efforts to get into like a transdisciplinary review of the literature. And there were people that were doing these, self-organization in inorganic chemical systems, and, questions about, like, even in quantum physics, there's there are hints of like natural selection. There's like question of like, well, what collapses the wave function? It's like, well, it interacts. And just as an aside, Julian Go, who is a buddy I met through the O'Shaughnessy Ventures program, he has been working on this big idea. Another musician and writer who's working on this huge cosmic idea, building on Lee Smolin's work and about how the universe itself is a unit of selection, and that our universe has evolved, like the conditions that are suitable for life in the universe as we know it are the product of a selection process of universes that create black holes create more universes, and universes that don't. And so you have, even there, you have a gradient, you have a direction, but it's emergent from, the interactions of all of these properties. I just wasn't
So,
satisfied with that. Anyway, yeah.
so you weren't satisfied because here's how it sounds to me. This sounds like a really great example of what I was trying to get at in your mind, the way that you can open boxes and threads in all directions from everything, So when you were a kid, did you suddenly have a moment, or not a kid, I guess a teenager, I don't know. Did you have this moment where you kind of had that, you were talking about you had this path, you're going to do this, and then
Hmm.
like did suddenly all these boxes start opening and you're like, okay, now I have to know about evolution and I have to know about the language and I have to know about all of this, and someone told you, well, that doesn't fit in this narrative, so you had to give up the narrative, or what was the dissonance there for you?
I asked four different respected professors of mine, how am I going to take this on as a graduate student? Because I had never any doubt that I was going to just go through that I would, like the PhD, that's the path. And all of them said, um, I, like basically, like in as many words, said, academia is a medieval guild system. And if you can't get the thing you want to research to fit in one of those boxes, then you're not gonna hack it. And it was a very disappointed statement. I mean, the people that were telling me this were brilliant and expansive thinkers, but they were talking about their own frustrations with, the disciplinary silos of the institution. And, a lot of them made it even more kind of blunt, in telling me that it's not just that you'll have a hard time asking these questions, but that, no graduate advisor will take you on because they want you working on a piece of their thing, and if you're working on something more ambitious than they are, then they will consider you, taking you on is actively inhibiting their plan to secure power in this incredibly competitive environment. And then they were, I mean, and I got to say, like, things have changed somewhat. This was 20 years ago.
You wanted to study complexity at a time when that wasn't possible.
I hit up SFI and I said, how do I do
Uh,
this? And they said, we don't have a grad program. Sorry, kid. You're on your own. And
and
the
they were
only,
probably
there,
pretty small back then too, right? I mean, now everybody knows who they are, but I mean,
Yeah,
I guess what I'm saying is that wasn't exactly a time when people were coming to professors wanting to study complexity so often, or that even that word was something people knew about a lot. But
I
you're
mean,
coming
people
at
were
it
hostile.
naturally in a way. Hmm?
They were that at it's funny because like I didn't I wasn't at SFI when this was the case, but for the first 30 years or so that they existed, uh, people thought it was bullshit. Like
Yeah.
they uh, one of the professors I spoke to and said, I want to study how life becomes more complex and how that's related to the up, the apparent increasing complexity of uh, the structures of cognition and like the inner life world of things. And I mean, and again, it's not that simple. Like, I'm not saying like, everything gets smarter. Um, it's not like that. It's that uh, new regulatory layers arise through these processes of like the reconciliation of these uh, attentional problems in some sense. And the within those new systems, like Jeff West at SFI, talks about the city and how like the bigger a city is, the more kinds of economic activity it can support. Which means, kind of, it's not really a paradox, but it's like it's easy to be, it's easier to find your way and like find your scene in a city if you're like really smart, but also easier to find your scene if I mean it's like, and we shouldn't even talk about smart and dumb because it's like there's the I'm starting to sound like David Krakauer, but like there's a it's like so many different kinds of intelligence, but for any given
Definitely.
distribution.
But it's almost like
uh,
you're saying you don't want to be aware of so many options. Sometimes that's to your benefit in certain cases or something like that.
But it's like if you
Yeah.
happen to be like there's fewer um, kinds there are fewer like social and economic functions in a smaller group of people, which means that like if you are well, it's like there isn't there's less noise to hide in. Like the cities are famous for like being able to just like become anonymous, and the privacy of these spaces where it's like in a small town, if you do something really stupid, everyone knows immediately, you know, um, and it matters more. And this is like an island biogeography thing. Beneficial or deleterious mutations in smaller populations have a much larger effect because they're happening in organisms that constitute a relatively larger fraction of those populations. So, but like on the mainland, you're in a like the British invasion, right? I always thought that this was interesting as like, in music you see this, that the islands are these like reservoirs of innovation that like so many of my favorite bands have come out of the UK or Iceland or Australia, but it's like it's because like there's anyway, so um I'm on a tangent, but I asked one of the professors about wanting to study complexity. And he just said, he looked at me with this like exhaustion. And he's just like, will you just tell me what complexity even is? Like, do you know? Does anyone know? And I was like, well, I mean, and that was it. It was like after that, I was working as a scientific illustrator at the Natural History Museum, and my boss, the former curator of herpetology, Linda Trube, said to me, I do think there's an option for you, which is that you could take an interdisciplinary fellowship, but it would mean putting a panel of people together that all work in different domains and don't understand each other and kind of actively dislike each other. And you're going to have to be the one to communicate for them. And I was like, I'm 21, like I'm a student. Like I'm trying to find people I can learn from about this, not have to like sit there dealing with the snark and backbiting of, you know, like I'm a child of divorce. Like I don't want to be in the middle of all of that. But of
Yeah, I know
course,
that feeling.
but that's where it is. You know, it's in the
But
middle.
that does
That's
relate to this bandwidth thing and the attention, and even what you were kind of bringing up about the music and the islands, because there's something about having a parameterized space where you can get more complex and kind of create something new and cool out of what seems kind of limited. But so, and then also, but it sounds like the bandwidth wasn't necessarily a problem for you at that time, but it was for everyone else. Like you seemed to have a lot of things you wanted to ask about, deal with, figure out, but nobody else could really hold all those things at once. Was that the feeling you had? Was it just kind of you were like too overwhelming or something?
it was overwhelming for me. I mean,
Yeah, okay, it was for you too.
it was because I didn't, you know, I'm speaking now from the position of having picked up 20 years of reading and insight and conversation about this stuff.
Hmm.
You know, I had a very rough idea of what I thought was going on, but I didn't know where to look for it. And so that's actually, you know, we talk about like one of the differences now compared to then is if you don't have the language for something, how do you even look for it on the internet or back then, like just
Right.
literal, just like libraries, right? But it's like this question of like, well, okay, so like years later, working at SFI, I realized how much of the research I was looking for had already been done by them, but it was buried in very inscrutable papers that I would not have even thought to look for in trying to answer these questions, like, you know, papers about economics or statistical physics or, you know, and it's like, how do you, like, the information scaling problem there is something that actually AI is like starting to solve right now, which is being able to recognize structural similarities between different domains and identify, like, you know, AI assisted science now is so interesting because it's basically doing at scale what my pattern seeking, you know, follow your intuition kind of right brain mode ended up having to do is just like notice, you know, the coastlines of South America and Africa and ask if they ever fit together.
Yeah. But I guess for me, it's kind of fascinating that you were already doing complexity and then you ended up sort of teaching complexity, is how I think about it in a way. Because you sort of synthesize all the stuff and give it to everyone. You've basically, like, in my opinion, I think you've taught a lot of people what complexity is in a weird way. So you were trying to answer that question. And then in a strange way, you've now taught a lot of people. I mean, and now it's a trending kind of thing. I wonder how that feels for you.
I mean, I'm not, uh, I showed up very late to that game. And I think I appreciate you telling me that I've played some sort of role in helping popularize intuitions about the behavior of complex systems. At the same time, you know, I was constantly reminded at SFI that I am not actually doing the research. Like I'm not formalizing quantitative models, you know, I'm not running simulations, I'm not choosing which hypotheses to pursue. But I eventually did get to a point where I was like, but I can help the scientists identify hypotheses that are worth pursuing because the thing that I was doing as the host of their show and all of that, I think had more value in some sense to an organization that had grown over the years and was, now scattered across the world, and, people that rarely saw each other in person and rarely spoke. And so like SFI, I think, was, going through one of these moments of fragmented attention, and, trying to clamber up the slope of the exponential production of new information. And, I think this is why, like, Brian Eno, when in 1995, I think this was Talking with Kevin, said that the 21st century would be defined by curation as an art form, because like everybody's in a network, like everyone's in the position to translate. No one's in the middle. Like there is this idea about, betweenness centrality in social networks, which is like, the more connections you have, the more central you are. But that's not true in a simple way. Everyone is on the edge of an indefinite number of things. And so all of us have this, to get all the way back to, the early comments on, each of us being a singular entity with, totally distinct histories and so on. Like the deeper you go into your unique context, the more you realize that you are the only person in the world who can broker certain kinds of relationships where you are. And that there's this tension between the, the way that society has taught most of us to think about, again, like jobs, like jobs are at a layer of abstraction, even like identity, like I was saying earlier, like even thinking I know who I am is an abstraction. And the more that I attend to the living context, the more, like, if I really want to pursue the inquiry of who I am, that, it follows this same sort of structure. Like one of the big, huge people in my life that I found while I was wandering the desert between academic and academic phase was Richard Doyle of Penn State. And Doyle's book
He's in the stack?
is in the stack. I mean, he's got several,
Mhm.
but this is the one I found first, Darwin's Pharmacy,
Oh, yeah.
Sex, Plants,
Yeah,
and the
great.
Evolution of the Noosphere. I
Hmm.
highly recommend him for your show. He's such
Okay.
a sweet, wonderful,
That's a good idea.
brilliant, humorous, heartful person. And he had written this book that was basically, putting together the pattern that I saw as a student about how information theory and evolutionary biology and consciousness and all of this stuff fit together.
Must have felt really
And
good to find that.
yeah, I mean, it was,
Mhm.
and it, it had not occurred to me at the time that it that would also include psychedelics, because like that's the missing piece of the evolution of syntactic language paper, was like, well, what exactly drove this sort of super production of salience in early human societies that demanded an evolution of language? Like, okay, part of it must have just been simply scaling, like more people. But like at the same time, scale, like the scaling of societies depends on greater coordination. So like you can't actually, like these things are in a complex relationship. And so Doyle makes the case that language comes out of us trying to explain the, like, these experiences that people were having, whatever it was, like the, psychedelic mushrooms or plants. And, he said like the thing that characterizes what he calls the ecodelic experience is that it makes you write about it. It makes you talk about it.
Yeah. Doesn't
What
even, I
it
mean,
does,
psychedelics, but also that kind of an experience, that kind of a
right? Any
life
kind of,
transformation feeling. You want to talk about
totally,
it, share it.
exactly. That you have a profound, meaningful experience of some kind, and it's in our nature to be, to try and be like, oh my God, how do I even put this into words? And so, he and that's, I mean, in a way, like finding complex system science was that kind of psychedelic experience for me. It was that, like, I don't have the language for this. Like, I see it, I
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
understand it, but then, like, how do I communicate it? And Doyle's work and other people, have convinced me that there is the unspeakable, like that there is knowledge that cannot be spoken. But at the same time, um, there is this perfect correlation that, I work as if, that mind and matter are two perspectives on something else for which there are not great words in English. And so you would expect a perfect, um, like reciprocal relationship where if you can experience something, then there is a way to describe it, even if it's not, or like you would see, or maybe it's not that you can talk about it in language, but that there is a material correlate to those experiences,
Or you
you
can
know?
recreate the pattern in some way, even with music or something. You can sort of,
Yes,
it's a pattern that you can show through a different medium. Or not even show. I mean, I hate all these, we always talk about vision, but that another person can sense through a different medium. It's the pattern, right? You can give that to someone in
right.
a song, a book. These things make us want to create, I think, and relate. As you're talking about all this, I'm thinking about how, because you said, yeah, you weren't doing the research, and that's important. The researchers are important, yes. But at the same time, as you said, you were looking for all this and hungry for it for a reason I think matters in the way that what you were just talking about matters, because we're having these experiences and we want to share them, and that's like part of some bigger thing for life in general. But and you couldn't find it. So what you did with the podcast, and I wonder, was it your idea to do podcasts, or did they ask you to do the podcast? I know you had to go through all kind of vetting and stuff, but using your kind of talent or your, I don't think anyone else would have done it that way, right? So maybe you weren't the only doing podcasting at that time, but you were definitely, doing it in a way others wouldn't. So you could do what I was talking about at the beginning, like take in that wealth of information and still put the attention on it in a way that could communicate it and sort of, create those third spaces that you were just describing for others so they could find them. I'm not trying to put you on a pedestal. I just, like, I really think that's kind of what was happening in a way that feels like important to note here. And I wonder if it relates to what you're saying at all.
Yeah. I mean, I told them in the job interview that I thought the obvious next thing for them to do was to start a show. And
And when
I
was
think
that? Sorry, because now everyone does a
2018.
podcast, but that was not the
Well,
case
I
then
had been running Future Fossils at that point already for
for a
several
long time.
years.
Yeah.
And that made me something of a reputational risk, I think, because it meant I already had an audience and a brand, and that I was willing to talk about things that the institution was not willing to take seriously and
Yeah.
did not want.
Almost the way you were talking about your professors didn't take them seriously. I see that as a kind of a beautiful thing that they sort of embraced that, and in so doing, it flipped. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, 2018, I came to them and I was like, if you're going to hire me for social media, like one of the things about this media environment is that it's inherently conversational, like to the point that I was saying earlier about like everyone's in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
everyone, it's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's, like that organization is literally on top of a hill, sort of, you know, trickling stuff down to the city. But I was like, that has changed. And, social media is not a propaganda machine when it's being used in the way that really honors its affordances as distinct from that which has come before. And also, like, podcasts are not, I mean, and lots of people are going to disagree with me about this, because, something has, been appropriated, the heat of the new and possible with podcasting. Very quickly people like decided that it was, very highly produced, that, it was going to be, the narrative format, like the things that people are calling a podcast now. That category is huge. And a lot of the excellent audio programming that exists in quote unquote podcast form now is actually more like audiobook or documentary, or radio
plays, kind of.
radio plays, and these are different things. Like, so like what I saw as really vital in podcasting as a medium was the way that it takes like, for instance, SFI is sort of internally known for having tea every day at 3 p.m. and everyone on site gathers in the kitchen and just chats each other up. And that's that when I say that, like, this is, that they were facing a sort of attention problem, that, that's not happening. It's like remote work is sort of like this. People don't meet around the water cooler. So how do you create this internal culture? But then, like, why that kind of internal culture matters, because, after SFI, I went on to work at an AI startup at the Mozilla Internet ecosystem for a while, and was doing some innovation research for them, looking at the structures and processes of legendary organizations like Bell Labs or Xerox PARC, the sort of Silicon Valley canon of badasses, ARPA. And we threw SFI and Pixar in there also, because I was like, I want, we're not just
good.
doing,
That's
but at
fun.
any rate, like, Pixar actually was an interesting outlier in that. But the point of that is just that, like,
So you're
one
bringing
of
the water cooler, but you're making it virtual. Was that your idea? Not the
yeah,
water
sort of.
kind of.
But, like, why does the water cooler matter is because it's not just about connecting people. It's about there being. So, like, if I talk about, like, the podcast as a book versus the podcast as generative discussion, one of them is like the crystallization of knowledge forms, and the other is the alchemization of knowledge forms, of, like, the high temperature search is what they, or
Isn't that what David calls you? High
yeah,
temperature.
simulated annealing high temperature search, like noise, like deliberate injection of noise into intelligent systems in order to enhance their creativity, which incidentally is also what, psychedelics are for the brain, what digital technologies are for human society, what I thought, SFI was for science. And, so, like, there are these moments where it's like, okay, we shouldn't be brainstorming. We're, like, about to ship. Like, we're like, there, we've made the thing, and there's like that, now is the time for that left brain sort of instrumental optimization kind of function. But we live in a world where as McGilchrist talks about, right, the successes of that efficiency, like the successes of the economics of scale, have given us a regime, what Zygmunt Bauman called liquid modernity, where it's like we live in a world of just like constant self-transformation, where like disruption has become like how much your people believe your company is going to disrupt things determines how much your company is worth, and so in that space, it's very hard. Like the balance has shifted from like, this is a stable regime where we know the rules and just play the game, because I think, like, I don't know if this has been your experience, but like it has certainly been my experience and that of many people I know, that, when they talk to their parents or grandparents, it seemed like they were living in a different universe strategically, that it was like, figure out the game and play the game. And now we're living in a world where it's like the game changes all the time, like something comes in. Incidentally, like one of my favorite games of all time is this game Flux. I talked about it when I was on Kevin Kelly's Cool Tools show. The reason I love Flux is because I feel like as a card game, it's like a lesson in this, when Brian Arthur talks about Taoist philosophy and economics and crossing the river stone by stone, the improv of complex systems thinking, that like Flux is this game where every new card you play changes the rules of the game for everyone else. How many cards you can play or draw, or what the win conditions are. And it's not to say that, so it's like, so in order to play that game, you learn that it's not like that strategy stops mattering. It's that strategy becomes like part of a larger consideration that's like the meta strategy of Flux, which is that if you want to win the game, you're playing what is effectively like an evolutionary algorithm of how, like, what increasing the likelihood that I will randomly be able to draw and play the cards that would guarantee my winning. And so it's like
It's like a
metabolic.
poise or a way of holding yourself or something.
Yeah.
But this winning doesn't really work anymore either, I don't think, because
Well, it's like luck production, and then
there's no winning though either. There's
that's just it.
Yeah.
That's
I
just
mean,
it.
being seen by the machine, to go back to your song,
Yeah.
seems to be winning, but that's not winning, because you need to be seen by the machine over and over and over and over and over.
Right.
So there's this weird tension in what you're saying, where I agree with you, like everything's become more uncertain. Being able to handle the uncertainty, which might be why we all want to be schooled in complexity, is better. Oh, show that again.
So yeah, so that's the finite and infinite games, and then also in Campagna's prophetic culture, right?
Yeah.
I want to let you finish your thing, but I do have a response.
Well, I was just saying, like, yeah, there's more uncertainty, so complexity helps us handle that, and that within itself has kind of become a way of doing business and strategizing, especially in particular communities. But on the other side of that, as you were talking, I was thinking about AI and the machine, the big machine, and that's so linear and so coding based, where you have to be everything. There's no uncertainty. You can't have uncertainty, and we're starting to give ourselves over to that kind of LLM way of thinking. So there's a tension there that feels very strange. You've probably seen podcasts change, but how podcasting has become almost like the medium of education for a lot of people these days. So you type something in, and then you get educated by the podcasts that come up. And that's due to the uncertainty of the conversation, like what's going to happen if it's not in that book form that you were describing. I think And that's maybe the kind of podcasting you were talking about. But then you have that uncertainty, and then you kind of linearize it into the code so that people can have it. And that's an interesting tension that's being held too. But
Yeah, well, okay, so like first of all, yeah, there is this weird parasocial dimension to podcasting that that was like very explicit in, back when I called my show Future Fossils, and I probably will eventually change it back, but like, the whole point was like, this is a trace fossil of a living dialogue. Like, and by the time you hear it,
yeah, right.
it's already in a museum, and at the same time,
I had never
um,
really gotten that. I always thought it was like future, dinosaurs of tomorrow or something.
oh man, well, there was also the, very, very preoccupied with this idea of sensitivity to future events, like the conversations I had with Eric Wargo and, his work on precognition and what changes, even if you don't believe that such a thing is possible, like what changes if you live in a way where you are reflecting on your present from an imagined future. Like if like the seven generations thinking, or, like
Mm.
the psychology is full of this support that people do better in life when they are in some sort of dialogue with their future selves, and so that was part of it too, which was like the presence of the future in the room now is a kind of time reversed fossil,
Yeah, I got
a
that part of
fossil of
it.
what
Yeah.
will be. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
That
so,
that's what's great about it.
but this thing about games, okay, so like f- Flux, yeah, you can win and lose the game, but the fact that the arbitrariness of it, like you can think you have a winning strategy and then suddenly everything changes and somebody wins on accident, which happens all the time in that
Well,
game.
that's
And
this uncertainty thing too, for
yeah,
sure.
so it's like that, like the reason I play that game is because it is so full of surprise that it's intrinsically fun. It's like it's not like, I mean, like I said, like there is some uh spread of like being able to do better, but nobody would hold Flux tournaments unless it was like an ironic joke, like, and so this is where like James P. Carse, Finite and Infinite Games, and he talks about on the back of the book, the rules of a finite game may not change. The rules of an infinite game must change,
Mm.
because the point of an infinite
To your
game
point.
is to keep the game going for as long as you can. That, and he says, society with its uh, limited prestige resource, like status is inherently limited, possibly, like probably even more fundamentally limited than attention, because you can cultivate attention, but like you're not taking someone else's attention when you do.
I don't
Um,
know about that. I mean, I'm thinking of C.T. Nguyen and this idea of gamification. Have you ever talked to him?
Twice. I love
Okay,
him.
I'm sure you have. Yeah. So, there's that too, isn't there? This cultivating the game so as to take your attention, or taking the
Well,
attention is
yeah.
just like the point of the game,
Well, there's
like Twitter or something.
yeah, the attention economy piece of it is a whole different thing. I mean, like meditation, like my own, the cultivation of my own interiority. Uh, I'd have to really think about it to try and come up with a way in which that takes someone else's consciousness. Yeah, like,
Because
like
that the,
that's,
the attention I'm talking about is already kind of like abstracted, right? But it is that machine thing that's in the song, and which I feel like
yeah.
is becoming very blurred with consciousness. And I don't mean that machines are becoming conscious. I just mean we're kind of giving ourselves over to that linear thing. Even like you in the store when you said, I think it was kind of prompted you to write the song, that you kept looking at your phone for who knows what reason, even though there was no signal or whatever. What is that to attention wise?
I mean, that, yeah. I mean, that's, I take that as an invitation to notice the ways in which I'm not actually paying attention. That like that, and this is one of the major threads of inquiry for humans on the loop, which is like, when are you being a robot? It's like there isn't this clean line, because again, like you're talking about no uncertainty and like fundamental uncertainty. And it's like, well, I I see, these things are like on like a kind of a Mobius strip where if you pursue um, your own agency as a thesis to its utmost extreme, eventually you're going to bump into something over which you have no control. And if you try to define the deterministic behavior of the cosmos, which seems for whatever reason to constantly be associated with trying to control that behavior, then eventually you get to the point that they got with quantum mechanics where you're like, we're bumping up against fundamental randomness or our own epistemic limits, hard limits, or like maybe there like quantum particles are actually choosing these things, which we can't like, we can't accept that they're, like Einstein, God doesn't roll dice, like,
Right.
but so like,
Hmm.
but these things do turn into one another at the extremes. And so like that was, when Zygmunt Bauman was writing about liquid modernity, it was like, yeah, the modern world holds this fundamental tension between striving for total control and striving for total transformation. And you can't have both, like that. And so what you get is neither total control nor total transformation, because these are just ideas. And you end up with something that like Danny Hillis and Neri Oxman at MIT both, in 2016 described as the age of entanglement, where, like I was saying earlier about Bill Thompson and the remix of ecology and industry. Kevin Kelly talked about it in Out of Control back in the 90s. David Krakauer has written about it as emergent engineering, where you operationalize evolution in design, to and like that's how people make vaccines and all kinds of things now. Yeah, it's like, but the game, right, is that in order to do that, like in order to like tango with the age of entanglement as the age of entanglement, and Doyle said that in Darwin's Pharmacy that that seeing oneself as emergent from, contained within, and all mixed up with what Darwin's tangled bank of evolution means that like who you thought you are is itself in flux and subject to change and fundamentally groundless and emerging within this larger, emerging in something that exceeds the world, that the world is like an epistemic artifact. And so like Campagna, I want to read you this really quickly because I love this passage from Prophetic Culture where he's talking about I ended a recent essay I posted to Substack with this because it's just so
Was it the
gorgeous.
multitudes one? Multitudes and holding paradox one?
Yeah, let's see. It's not stuttering. It's, hold on, I'll find it. Yeah. Rather than promoting apathy and fatalism, a prophetic gaze offers that reassurance against the anguish of loss and of becoming, which is by necessity the foundation of any meaningful action. He says, seen as one island surrounded by other spaces, the world itself turns from a serious game into a game that can be played seriously. It has its own unbreakable inner rules, and its lure and threats can often feel overwhelming, yet it is just a process taking place within a specific board. Even if one wished to end their act before its natural closure, they wouldn't have to do so with acrimony, rather like players gracefully abandoning the table. Prophetic culture offers another room in the house beyond the games room, and a place from which it is possible to intervene on the world as if always returning to it. He says, it's no longer a win-all, lose-all ordeal in a boundless desert. Worldly existence manifests itself as one layer in a larger event, exceeding for the most part our ability to catalog it linguistically, which, he says, finally allows one gains the ability to act within the world. Action will no longer put at stake one's whole existence, since nothing is ever lost entirely. No failure is absolute, no life is ever wasted. Perhaps it is possible to direct and to produce historical events only when one's own will is sustained by an awareness of the ineffable excess overflowing the maps of language. And then he quotes Hugo Ball. He says, it is impossible at the same time to be artists and to believe in history. So like,
Whoa,
Campania
there's so
makes a
much in there I don't
distinction.
even know. It reminds me of the slaying technology with art too from
Yeah,
William Irwin
yeah, yeah,
Thompson
yeah.
a little bit.
Technology slays the victim and resurrects it with art. And that's
Right.
what Thompson's saying in Imaginary Landscape about the mind in the era of planetary culture. That like all of this, that the information scaling crisis and its ego death for like the individual trying to make sense of, the 21st century, that, you know, as with Campania is saying, well, the prophet is not a mystic. The prophet is not rejecting the world. The prophet is not claiming that the world is an illusion. The world is there. It's just also part of the eternal. And so like the mind in planetary culture is slain by technology in as much as like you begin to see yourself through the lens of like algorithmic thinking, or like you begin to see the ecological relationships out of which humankind and your own, like big data, like real simple, like the quantified self, like you start to see all of these patterns in your sleeping behavior and your blood sugar and all this stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
you start to see these relationships, and then you realize like, oh, the mood I was in the other day was like, you have an explanation for a much richer description of what's going on, that in a way similar to like you know uh, meditators describe this. So like like the more rich and detailed your observation of the mind, the more the mind looks like uh, just like a karmic machine. Like the more it's just like the stuff is just happening, it's doing itself, and is a very, there's an infinitely complex machine that at that point you can't separate from being alive. But it's like it does have its sort of self-existing rules that, and so it's like, well, okay, like it's doing itself on its own.
I think you can separate it from the machine though. I mean, I see what you're saying, but I think there's a danger in thinking it's just that okay, so like, yeah, we start picking up on our own patterns in a way that feels a bit like mechanical in the sense that you just described, but there's also kind of a threshold, or for some reason, I'm thinking of how you describe the web as a psychedelic experience. Like there's a point where you kind of lose coherence with all the
Mhm.
information that's coming in. And that can be a psychedelic experience, or that can be a poverty of attention, to go back to the thing. And what's the difference there, in your life? Or, I mean, do you want to be seen by the machine? Do you get stuck in this crazy kind of algorithmic wanting to be seen by the machine? Or do you have the psychedelic experience of it? Or are those the same for you? Or, there's something really nuanced there that feels important.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, like, saying that's like attending to the operations of one's own mind reveals it as machinic. There are still important distinctions between the way in which that might be described as machinic and the way in which a car operates or
Right. And
whatever.
what
And
life, biological,
yeah,
ecological actually
yeah.
is. Yeah.
At the same time, I think like the essays I've been writing lately are about how impoverished and inadequate these categories of life and machine really are, and how we really do need better language at this point, which is I linked to Michael Levin's piece in Noma magazine where he makes a very similar case. He's like, these are models. These are just ideas about the world, and the world is changing very fast.
You and I've talked
And
about that a lot.
yeah,
Yeah, it's an
so
important distinction. It's one reason I brought it up. But I wonder for you, because we don't have that much more time. But I'm really
sure,
interested in like how you do it. I know you write songs. That's your encoding mechanism and so on. But you also you sort of showed me just a minute ago when you said you noticing that you're noticing your phone is almost like that seems like a positive thing. Oh, it's a kind of a look what I'm doing, and you seem to have even pushed out to a different scale in terms of even the big machine. Or are you trying to do that, or what
yeah.
kind of
I mean,
experience are you having with all this? Because it also brings up what you said at the beginning about wanting to be the only. I mean, you showed me that you pushed hard against anyone telling you that you're like someone else, and that theme I could explore with you for a long time. But I have thought of it through this conversation about how that's pushed you to be strange or weird. That's a word could have talked about. If people think you're weird, if you want to be weird, if you're trying to be weird, um, and how that fits to this big
right.
machine wanting to be seen by the
Yeah,
machine.
yeah. Well, that's just it, right? Is that like uh, the more we allow ourselves to be, governed by the idea, whether it's our own categorical abstractions or it is the constraints on our behavior by a system that is operating on us in uh, like cybernetic co-evolution between what we classically think of as human and machine, like that there is this question of like how much do you want your life to be determined by abstractions, again, like whether you think of them as yours or whether you think of them as someone else's abstractions of you. um, and classic, like, I'm a loner, Dottie, a rebel. I'm a
Yeah, I'm an
free
outsider.
thinker like everyone else. I'm an outsider. It's like, okay, like relative to what? Like relative to the subset of all people that think that way, you're certainly not. And one of the conversations I had from my show that really that I just adored, was with K. Alato McDowell, who had written Pharmaco AI, which was the first book
Oh,
co-authored
I don't know that.
with
Okay, I have to look for that.
GPT-2
Ah,
back in the day now.
wow,
um,
yeah.
LLM prehistory almost at this point, but uh, and had written a really interesting piece called Neural Interpolation for Gropius Bao about how each new media environment creates different selves, like the self of broadcast media. This is based on Fred Turner's thinking about this, that the self of broadcast media is different from the self of immersive, is different from the self of network media. And then Kay was saying, well, like now we live in an age of neural media where you're not just thinking like the affordances for the conceptualization of selfhood in this environment are not just like I'm in a network, I'm a point on a graph, but that you're made out of networks, interacting with technologies that are made out of networks. Both of those things are evolving. They're evolving together. They're both inside of larger networks. And so, it's like we're in a very conversational media
Yeah.
environment that's
Mm.
fundamentally evolutionary. And so, like, when years ago, I wrote this piece called Improvising Out of Algorithmic Isolation that I'll send you that.
That's a great title.
It's like, this is my friend asked me to write a piece about, surveillance, capitalism, and art, and like improv, and how to think about, like stealing some piece of our humanity back out of the jaws of this thing. And what I kind of get to in that piece is that how, if you are co-evolving with these things, there's always some bit of like, you become the enemy. It's like the machines are becoming more lifelike, but it's not that we're becoming purely. It's like we are starting to see the ways in which, I am already on autopilot most of the time. I'm already operating on abstractions much of the time. What is conscious in me is not like, you'll never be totally conscious in the sense of like, perfect information integration across every layer of your being. I mean, if that is possible, it's certainly not possible for you
I
to
think we
be
would blow up. I mean, if we were
human
conscious of
anymore,
everything.
So like, yeah, I think it's just, like for me, it's just become like my practice with this is, try and see where categorical thinking and the use of models and abstractions is like fit to task. And on the other side of it, where am I doing that? Like, where am I assuming that something is real when it's just an idea? And when am I assuming that ideas are just ideas when it's better to understand them as real? Like that there's this like flat ontology where like ideas are, you know, like I was saying earlier, like they exist in some way. There's a material, descriptive, behavioral correlate for all of these things, whether you measure it by the influence on people's behavior, whether you were to say like, look, I've got a map of all of the people that are, that people talk about the internet weighing as much as a strawberry, like all the electrons in it.
Mm-hmm.
You
But I
know,
hear
so it's
you.
just
It's like
like,
the psychedelic part of that was missing from the syntax paper in a way. That whole
yeah,
part.
yeah. The practice for me is just to get better at noticing full stop. Just to get better at
Yeah, just
noticing
that. Yeah.
and to
And
have
does
fun
that
with it, because that's this point, right?
right the
Like,
game?
that's what these authors are saying is like when you are able to, like, the only way that you can actually have fun playing a game is to do this. Otherwise it just becomes horrible.
Does it help you be weird? Because I don't know if you actually feel strange or weird, or for example, like when you go to a party and someone's like, "What do you do?" and this kind of thing.
Hmm.
You can't just give. I don't know if you ever in your life, after were a shoe salesman, that you had a like whatever, standard answer to that. I don't know if anyone does, to be honest. I think it's a little bit of that could be a whole other discussion. But you know what I mean? It's this not fitting, which sounds like you wanted from the beginning, in a sense, not to fit. And
uh,
I'm not trying to say you were trying to be an outsider, but there's something in you that was resisting going along with something. And I wonder
mm,
if that practice of noticing is part of like what that does, or if that's changed now that you're going through all these transformations yourself, that podcasting is going through transformations, that you're in a flux state. And is that
yeah.
your natural state? I don't know. I'm asking a lot of questions at once because I'm not sure what the question is, but it has something to do with, is it helping you right now? Do you even need help right now?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, this we can try and land it here. That, like, I think this idea of being distinctive is a red herring in as much as it is an idea of like what it means to be distinctive on the basis of, what you see everyone else doing, right? Or what you think, where you think the attention is concentrated in the economy. But what really makes people singular in that kind of way is, found through a process of, individuation and a discovery of the core. I mean, I won't even call it like the core, but like the discovery of deeper values. And if at risk of
Could it be
sounding like
care instead of core? Is it possible?
yeah. So like at risk of sounding like I'm telling people to find themselves, which is a very sort of late modern consumer, like lifestyle consumer capitalist thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that. It's the like okay, it may be that for you at some point along the path, but it becomes this thing of like if you just practice attending to what is interesting. And I'm sure you've heard this from so many people, like so many interesting people talk about their careers, and they're just like, I just follow what I am deeply passionately interested in, and sometimes it changes. And
Follow
but
your
this thing
bliss,
is
that
like,
idea?
so what? Yeah, well, it's it's not always blissful, or it
No.
is blissful in the sort of like the scary way that like bliss, the way that it was like Teresa of
The edge, yeah.
Avila talks about, like it's not always fun.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like
The strange and marvelous bird that shrieks at you. I don't know if you know that
yeah,
Yeats poem, but when one of your posts you talk about we have to turn around and look at AI, and it reminded me of that poem where they at the end of it, it's called Her Triumph. At the end of it, they turn around and look at this crazy bird that's like shrieking at them, and it's sort of love, right, and care and self, in the way you're describing right now.
yeah,
This whatever this is,
turn and
this
face the strange, right? David
yeah,
Bowie.
let it shriek at
Yeah.
you, and it is you, and all of that.
I mean, I guess, in some way, I think that like I am convinced, and this is a subject for another whole like discussion, but like I'm convinced that the future of like society is one in which jobs don't exist, but that people actually get paid for doing what they love. And there's a dark side to that too. Like I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this. There is a sense in which, you could argue that like this like technology slays the victim and resurrects it as art comment Thompson is making about the mind includes, the sculpture of the human mind by these vast distributed systems, the big machine, and that we end up with like, Brave New World. But like, I don't think that Brave New
Miniaturizing
World,
nature or whatever.
yeah, I don't think Brave New World is the whole story. And I don't think, uh, the Kevin Kelly angle on the automation of the economy is the full story. But I do think that like like if you really care about being like, in a way, it's like a position of faith. It's like, why are you interested in what you're interested in? You didn't really choose that. Um, maybe it's worth experimentally trusting that this sort of kind of dystopia of human AI civilization, evolving the attention economy into something where you want what we tell you to want. Maybe it is already that way, in the same way that like that the biosphere is already doing this, in the same way that like some people think, oh God, like becoming pregnant is like having some alien grow inside of you, and then it changes your brain, it makes you love it, gross. But then like becoming a parent doesn't feel like that for most people. You're like, oh,
That's kind
this
of the
is
point
right.
too. I mean, that's
This
why
is right.
that
This is
happens.
good. And so, people like Mike Levin, my buddy Tom Morgan, I talk with a lot of people about this sort of like, just for lack of a better term, like trusting in synchronicity and trusting that like learning to hear the call, like learning to be sensitive to these, like, what, whether they are or not, like nudges or winks or, these kinds of things feel like, because I mean, I have no reason to doubt that I don't stop at my body, like I don't stop at my skin, or my idea of myself. And we're all connected in mysterious ways. And as my buddy Josh DiCalio says, uh, ontologically inseparable, you know?
Yeah. That it makes me think of for some reason when you were talking I was thinking of this kind of light, like shining from the chest, which sounds completely nuts, but there are these things that you kind of gravitate towards, right? It does feel like that at times, like you just can't, in the way you were with dinosaurs or the way you were with complexity even, the way I am with this whole dichotomy paradox theme. So you can't let it go. You said that earlier. You just can't, I just couldn't let it go. And there's really something to that that's important and not just woo kind of stuff. And what you said also about there are these moments of rhyming or synchronicity, or even just where the world's like a little lighter and brighter and you feel it and you remember it. And it's like, we don't have to get mystical about what all that is, but it's there
Mm.
and everyone feels it. And it seems like part of that practice of noticing you were talking about, you start to notice that. And there's something to that, there's something to that that's if we start doing that more, then what you said about not having jobs and doing what we love becomes really interesting because, well, I mean, to end, let's talk about love because is love a feeling or is it something we're making? And I would say it's something we're making. We feel it, but it's something we're making. And if we practice in the way you just said, that is interesting to think of that glowing light. That sounds silly what I'm saying, but those moments where you're pointing towards something and you recognize it and you didn't choose to point towards it in a sense, or the world is brighter. That's kind of interesting to think about doing what we love if that's what's leading that, if that's what we're making the love out of. Just to end, I'd like to hear what you think about all that, or even just this word love and care. And I know you
Mm.
got married recently too, but
Yeah, but I mean, to my partner of 20 years,
yeah.
um, and the kids were
But
both
that's even
there
bigger
at
actually,
the
that
wedding.
20 years and then you got married. I mean,
Our daughter was the flower girl and our son was the
that's so
ring bearer.
sweet.
Um,
But you know
yeah,
what I mean with this love, doing what we love. Love isn't passive either, is it?
no, it's funny because, like, this whole story that I'm telling you over the course of this call has been at the same time, like while I was going through this, shock of, like, discovering deeper questions and wondering who I am, and traveling all over the place and trying to figure stuff out. That's the same period of my life where I met my wife, and we were going through our own sort of relational version of that. And those two things can't really be separated from me.
Mhm.
And, because our lives were so crazy for so long and made so little sense, um, and it was very hard to, like, for years, she and I wondered, like, God, it seems like the world is just conspiring against us. Like, like, we can't land this for some reason. And it made me want to, like, cut her loose and be like, I cannot possibly be good for you.
Mm.
Like, this is an insane relationship. This is nuts. Um, and yet, I think, there was something about the fact of, like, no matter how hard we tried to make sense of it, we couldn't. But then no matter how hard we tried to, like, act on this idea that the other person would be better off without us, that never worked either. And that the love in our relationship is, um, not just an active thing that we are doing, but, like, it felt like an active field in which we were arising. Like it was making us as much as we were making it, and like it was like a tulpa or something. You know, it was like an egregore. It was like an entity. Our love was holding us together no matter what our conscious minds were doing, because we were creating it, and therefore it needed us to survive or something. And like
Yeah.
we'd
I
go
just
through
had to
these
talk about the
periods.
third entity, and that reminds me of it. It's like a
Yeah,
third entity that's there. Yeah.
yeah. So like the thing that another thing, the last thing I'll say about that is that I think that the missing piece on the language, like on the discourse around evolution and emergence of order and all of this stuff, tends to be the involution. You know, that the order doesn't just come from nowhere. It's brought into focus. It comes from something. It's like stepped down from the ineffable into the world in some way. And you know, so like that, you know, like people who think that, you know, we are making machine gods. It's like, not exactly. Like I'm more on the, like Rudolf Steiner, like it's the incarnation of Ahriman, you know, like it is, it's not that it's not, it's not that it's not happening. It's just that you have to be kind of oblivious to the fact that like these beings already exist and are in this sort of relational co-arising with the forms that they take in the sliver of reality we actually can observe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Yeah.
love. Like
I
love,
think, yeah.
love is like being
Well,
swept
actually,
up
yeah.
into something that challenges your ego boundaries, you
Well,
know.
the third entity that you described with your wife, but it's a different scale of it happening in terms of time and space. It's hard to think about that, but
That's the big machine.
I
It's
hope
like
so. I hope
the
so.
big, you know, like the big machine is actually like, no, that's you. That's you and everybody you care about and everybody
No
you
wonder
don't.
we want to be seen by the big machine.
Yeah, no
Love.
wonder. It's like, yeah, it's like the dog, the video of the dog biting its own leg, growling, snarling at its own leg. You know?
Speaking of dogs, I need to walk my dog. But I've really loved talking to you, and I really appreciate it. I appreciate what you gave and all this. There's a lot to seep in there.
Yeah. Well, I thank you for being so present and kind and curious.
Thank you, Michael. I hope you have a nice day there. Good day. I'll try to remember or figure out the name of the trees outside.
I'll send you
other entities entirely, or is that even how to see this sea? Doom scrolling, like subscribe, you're trolling, find it, try. Everybody wants to be seen by the big machine. Then Poland, leaving you, rage swollen, gathered you. Everyone's solution is squeezed by the big machine. Everybody wants to be pleased by the big machine.
And now I'm going to read one of my favorite poems. Actually, I have it memorized. It's one of the first ones I ever memorized. It's called Her Triumph by William Butler Yeats. I did the dragon's will until you came, because I had fancied love a casual improvisation, or a settled game that followed if I let the kerchief fall. Those deeds were best that gave the minute wings, and heavenly music if they gave it wit. And then you stood among the dragon rings. I mocked being crazy, but you mastered it, and broke the chain and set my ankles free. St. George, or else a pagan Perseus. And now we stare astonished at the sea, and a miraculous, strange bird shrieks at us.